everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm glad you're here. Today I have a throwback magic review for you. We're taking a look at Ben Train's At the Table lecture. Now, I picked up this lecture about 4 years ago, and the reason why I decided to do this review today was because I was looking at some of my old lectures that I'm still using material from, and this one popped up. And it seems to be on sale because you can pick up this lecture for $8 now from Vanishing Ink Magic. You'll get a lecture that's over 2.5 hours long. You're going to learn 8 routines, a bunch of variations, and some tips. Most of the material is impromptu card magic, and if you know who Ben Train is, then you would expect that. There is one effect which uses Skittles, although you could use any objects you want, and it's like an excellent impromptu effect that probably once you learn it, you'll be using it too, just like I do. And as I mentioned, I'm still using more than 50% of the material on this lecture, which is why I thought it would be a good idea to do a review on it. I have not seen any review on YouTube of this. As usual, I'm going to try to give you guys my impressions of this lecture, give you a rundown of what you can expect, try to answer your questions along the way, give you my rating, and a couple of final thoughts. So as I mentioned, this is all impromptu card magic with the exception of one of the routines. Difficulty-wise, I would say it's like advanced beginner. Some of the effects are completely self-working. There is one effect really which I would say maybe requires a small amount of skill, but the rest of the stuff is really advanced beginner level. There are no gimmicks or gaffes in play. As I mentioned, it is all just card magic, and I really liked the lecture a lot because I thought that Ben Train gave you lots of material that you're going to use. The first 3 effects in the lecture actually are put together, so he actually presents them all together as a routine, which is really kind of nice because in that way you can also use them in the exact same way. If you want, you could use those 3 effects together, and that can be like a little set. So that's really nice. I liked how all along the way he actually teaches you the moves he uses, variations, other ideas of how you can apply the principles that he's teaching you. And I really liked how the material he teaches you really is his material. This isn't like that he's taken other people's effects and just added something to it and put his name on it. These are all effects that he's come up with himself. And most of this stuff is published in magazines and books, and we'll get to that as I go through this. So that's really my impressions, and as I mentioned, I've used more than 50% of this material. I still use more than 50% of this material, which is why I think this is a lecture that you probably should pick up if you're interested in card magic especially, but if you just like magic in general. So let's take a look at the different effects. The first effect is called Ace Cutting and Semi-Automatic Cutting 2, and he actually goes over the 2 variations of this. He goes over the main version where you take out a deck, you have a spectator make a selection, they return it, and then you tell the spectator that they're going to do the effect. You ask them to cut to see if they can cut to their card. They cut to a card, it's not their card, but whatever it is, you tell them, oh, that's an indicator card, we're going to count down to it. You count down to it, you find their card, and immediately you're going to produce a 4 of a kind based on where you count down to, and that is the first effect. He teaches you 2 versions of it. One version doesn't really use any sleight of hand, and then the second version uses, I would say, minimal sleight of hand. And the main reason for that is because there's kind of like an estimation that's involved, but it's more impromptu. There is a very minor setup that is involved, so that's something else that you may want to think about there. And you can find both of these versions published in Steve Beam's book, Semi-Automatic Card Tricks Volume 9. So both of these versions were published in that book. If you have it, you can actually look it up. He immediately goes into his bold assembly afterwards, which is an assembly that even if you don't like assemblies, you'll probably like this one because it's extremely bold, but it's very fast. It's an assembly that you'll be done with it like in about a minute. So some of the reasons why people sometimes don't like assemblies is because some people say like it doesn't make sense that you're putting the aces out into, you're putting them out, and then you're putting cards on top of 3 of them, and then they vanish and join the leader pack. But with this bold assembly, it is so fast, everything seems so motivated, that your spectator is going to do a double take when they realize that the aces are already gone. So I think this is like an assembly for people that don't like assemblies, because it really feels more like just a very quick transposition. I like it a lot. I use it all the time because it is a completely impromptu type of assembly, and it's so easy to perform. There's no difficult sleight of hand at all, and that's because of how bold it is. Very clever thinking. I really like it a lot, and it flows really well right after the first effect. And then after that, he went right into his Trinity effect. The Trinity effect is an effect that you probably perform something similar to it if you use a memorized deck. What I really like here is that his version of the effect, he shuffles the cards right before he starts. He has 3 spectators come up to help him. He has 1 spectator cut off a group of cards, a second person and a third person. They each look at the card they cut to, they reassemble the pack, and then here, before he even touches the cards, he starts telling one of the spectators characteristics about the card that they merely cut to, which is great. It's really nice. It feels like he already knows the selection, which is great. And I really like his presentation because he makes it build up really well, where that first person, he starts telling them about their card, and he picks up the deck and he goes through it. He takes out 1 card, puts it on the table because that's going to be their selection. The second person, all he has to do is just touch them. He doesn't look at the cards or anything. He immediately tells them. And then the third person, he doesn't even have to touch them or anything. He can also just tell them their card as well. And so it's like a very fast way of revealing the 3 selections. And he said that this was his solution to trying to do like a tossed out deck routine. If you're familiar with the tossed out deck routine, it is extremely similar to that, where 3 people are peeking at a card, and then the magician tells each person what card that they've peeked at, basically is what it is. Normally this effect is done like with a memorized deck, or a deck that has a significant order to it, or a stack, and it relies on those kinds of principles. But here Ben Train has put some really clever thinking to this, where you don't need any of that, and you're still able to very quickly tell each person what card that they are merely thinking of at that point. I really liked it a lot, and personally it was my favorite effect on here, on this project, on this lecture, because it's so reliable and it's so easy. There's no sleight of hand. You will be using this, there's no question about it. So it's a really good effect. And again, this was the 3rd effect in those series that he put together as like one routine. So you may want to perform those 3 exactly as he did, or not. You may not want to. I like this effect just to do it like off the cuff when somebody has some cards, and the reason is because it plays really strong, and I really like how you start the effect by taking the cards and giving them a shuffle right before you start. So it really looks fair. It looks like there's absolutely no way that you can know anything about the cards that each person just randomly cut to. All right, so the next effect is called Candy from Strangers, and this was the one effect that had nothing to do with cards here on this lecture, although as I mentioned, it has a mental flair to it, and this effect can also be performed over Zoom or Skype. You put out 5 Skittles, you have your spectators start on one, you turn your back, and then they make a series of decisions. They're moving from one Skittle to another based on what they want to do. And then as you go, you're able to eliminate some of the Skittles, and then finally you've eliminated all of them except for one, and you turn around, and of course that's the one that they are on. And as I mentioned, you can also do this over Skype. It's completely self-working, and the spectator is going to feel like they had a lot of options that they could have moved in the direction that they wanted to go in, and they'll be amazed that you're able to tell them which one they end up on at the end. As I mentioned, this is like the perfect impromptu piece because you can do this not just with Skittles, but with any 5 objects. And I think once you learn it, you won't forget it, and it's be something that you'll be able to perform at the drop of a hat whenever you want to, whenever you need some impromptu miracle that you want to pull out of your back pocket, well, then this is something that you'll have ready to go. And so even though this had nothing to do with card magic, I think for most people, it will definitely be a highlight of the lecture. So the next effect is called Detour on 51st Street. And this effect is a sandwich effect of thought of cards. It is an impromptu effect, and actually it's very reminiscent of John Bannon's Dawn Patrol. So if you like Dawn Patrol, then you're really going to like this a lot. You give a deck to your spectator and you let them shuffle it, so it's completely impromptu. You have the spectator deal out a couple hands of poker, and what you do is you pick up a hand and you show the spectator and you tell them maybe somebody will be thinking of like this card. You mention the card, like for instance, like a Queen of Diamonds. You pick up another hand and you show them that maybe the other spectator, maybe somebody else will be thinking of another card that you point out. And then you tell them that you want them to simply look at the card that is on the top of the cards that they're holding on to. The remainder, they remember that card. Then they reassemble the deck themselves. They put the jokers either on the top or on the bottom, and then they give the deck a couple of cuts themselves. You take back the deck, you do one shuffle, one pharaoh, you immediately spread it out, and now you're able to instantly just pick out of the spread the first card that you mentioned somebody might think of just randomly, and then the second card. And so you've shown them that you can do shuffle tracking. And of course, the two jokers that were face up have trapped one card, which of course is the selection. And that's why I said it's very reminiscent of John Bannon's Dawn Patrol, because in John Bannon's effect, it's exactly like that, where a spectator makes a selection and then two face-up cards trap it after you do one pharaoh. The issue with John Bannon's Dawn Patrol is that there's a lot of procedure, because the spectator has to cut the cards, cut some cards off, shuffle, peek, then they cut off some more and add it to it, then they put this back on the deck, then give it a couple of cuts, then give it to you, and then you also have to cut the cards before you do a pharaoh. So there's like a lot of stuff involved. And because John Bannon's Dawn Patrol uses a key card, the deck cannot be shuffled before you start. In this version, the deck is shuffled by the spectator before you start. In fact, almost everything is done by the spectator. The only thing that you're really doing is when you pick up one of the hands and show them, like, okay, you know, they may be thinking of this card, and you mention it. That's all you're really doing. I mean, the spectator is the one who's putting the deck back together. They're the ones that are really cutting the deck themselves a bunch of times, and then all you do is do one shuffle after they've added the face-up jokers. So it's an excellent version of this type of plot, of like a type of searcher's plot, or like progressive sandwich type. It's just really like a sandwich plot. So if you're a fan of that, I think you're going to like it a lot. I like it a lot. Again, the only reason why I would say that it's intermediate difficulty is because there is a pharaoh involved. So that's the only thing that you're going to have to do. Following that effect, Ben Train goes over his DVD project that he did with Chris Mayhew. That was called A Series of Unfortunate Effects. So he just kind of talks a little bit about that. And then he goes into his next effect, which was called Pi Location. Now, Pi Location is an impossible location effect. That was my second favorite effect on this lecture. And if you like locations and impossible locations, then you're really going to like this a lot. Ben Train calls it the fairest card trick, and it really does feel like the fairest card trick ever. The effect is like this. You give the spectator the deck, they shuffle the cards, they cut off a group of cards, they quietly count those cards to themselves, they have a number in their mind, you don't know what it is, then they're going to look and remember a card based on the number they're thinking of, then they reassemble the deck and then give it a cut or a couple of cuts, then give it back to you, and all you do is go through the deck and just take out one card, which is their card. And so it's going to totally blow them away. In fact, once you learn the method and the principle, then you'll be able to actually apply a variation of it and do it over Skype or Zoom. And so it's very reminiscent of, for instance, like if you like Lewis Jones material, you may have his book Person to Person. There was an effect in there called Trump Call, which I used to perform years ago. And that effect was an effect that you'd have to keep track of cards with a piece of paper. And that's why it was good for doing over the phone. You could still actually do that over Skype or Zoom, but this version of that type of effect, like an impossible location, is even better, because if you were to do it over Skype or Zoom, instead of you going through the cards and taking one out, you could just have the spectator name the cards off the top of the deck, and then when you get a sensation, you could tell them, oh, I got a sense that that's your card there, and of course that's going to be their card. It's completely self-working, no sleight of hand, and completely impromptu. It's an excellent location effect, and if you like that kind of effect, then you're really going to like this a lot and you're going to use it. So personally, it was my second favorite effect on this lecture, and I'm still using it today, 4 years later. After that, he goes over some tips for how to glimpse a key card, and then he goes over his Triumph routine, which he called Triumph version 136. You can also find that published in Sid Siegel's Full Metal Jacket notes, and I know it was also released on some other projects by Ben Train. Ben Train's Triumph is an impromptu triumph, and in this teaching of it, he basically just goes over it. It's a very simple, quick triumph routine. What I like is that it doesn't use a standard triumph shuffle. It uses a shuffle that looks like a completely legit shuffle, which is great. And he does give you a couple of finesses which will help you make your triumph look a little bit more fair, a little bit more magical. Finally, the last effect is a progressive sandwich effect, which he doesn't have a name for it. And I think he just goes over it at the end of the lecture just as an extra effect. But in that effect, spectator shuffles the cards before you begin. And what you do is you have the spectator select a card, they look at it, and then you're going to take two red queens or whatnot, and they go in the deck face up in different spots. And what you do is you hand the cards to the spectator, and in the spectator's hands, the queens come together and trap their selection. And then, like as a kicker, you take the cards back, you put them on the table, and immediately you're able to spread the cards, and now there's 3 more cards in between those face-up queens, and they of course are the other 3 cards that are the mates of the one that they selected. So if they selected, for instance, like a 5, then you have the other 3 5s there. So it's a nice little progressive sandwich routine. I really did like the kicker. Very easy to perform. Again, it's like another effect that you may want to take a look at if you're interested in it. As you can see, there's a lot of really good card magic on this lecture. Everything is really quick. None of the effects are really long or drawn out. None of the effects really require any very difficult sleight of hand. I would say the most difficult sleight of hand on here was probably the Pharaoh Shuffle for the one effect, and then maybe a variation of one of the effects where you have to do a zero. He does go over the zero briefly, although he does give you some references of where you can check that out. So let's take a look at my rating for this lecture and then some final thoughts. So my rating is as follows for originality and novel ideas. I give him a 4 out of 5. I thought all of these effects were very original to him. As you can see, that none of the ideas that he's presenting here, you're not going to be able to find them like anywhere else. For creativity, I would give him 4 out of 5. I thought that the effects were very creative. I really liked his thinking, especially about routining and how to put some of these effects together to build like a routine. I thought that was great. So I really liked his thinking behind that. And just overall, I really liked the economy of motion of all of these routines. They were structured very well. So it looks like you've done almost nothing in most of these routines because of the structure of them. In terms of the teaching, I would give him 5 out of 5. I thought the teaching was excellent. I really liked how he gave you a lot of variations of each effect. He gave you ideas of how you can take each effect in different directions. You don't see that often, but you could tell that he has used all of these routines for years because he knows exactly how to use them in many different ways, and he gives you lots of different ideas. So you're not just learning an effect, you're learning also how to use that principle in many other different ways. In terms of practicality, I would rate it as 4 out of 5 because all you need is a deck of cards. There are no gimmicks or gaffes in play, so that was really good. In terms of magic tips, nuances, and just going over different moves and stuff, I would give him a 3.5 out of 5 because I thought he did a great job. He also does a pretty good job on different presentational ideas with each of these routines, so I thought that was good as well. And then finally, for the price, I would rate it as 4 out of 5 because at $8, this is a steal at this time. You're getting a 2.5-hour lecture where you're going to use a vast majority of the material on here. As I mentioned to you guys, the effect Trinity I think is really just worth the price of this, although for some people the pi location will be just as good, and the impromptu mental gem that he gives you with the Skittles, which was called what was it, Candy from Strangers. That effect is an excellent effect that you're going to use all the time, and like I mentioned, you could even do it over Zoom just with impromptu objects. So my final rating for this lecture is 4.08 out of 5. Highly favorable. Of course, I highly recommend this to you guys because I think this is excellent magic. I think that there's been a lot of thought that's been put behind each of these effects, and I think that you're going to be watching the whole 2.5 hours and you're going to get a lot out of it. So as usual, if you guys have any questions or comments, just leave them for me below. Thanks so much, guys, for tuning into my magic reviews, and I will see you on the next one.